The chair they gave Riva was too small. Not insultingly small. Just the kind of small that reminded her, every few minutes, that this room was not built with humans in mind. The Galactic Council Hall curved around her in a perfect circle, tiered seats rising on all sides like the inside of a shell. The light was white and even, coming from everywhere and nowhere. It made shadows disappear. It made everything look equally important and equally cold. 12 delegates sat above her. She could see all of them without turning her head, which she suspected was the point. Goss, the Vreth elder, held the review file in one long gray hand. His skin had the texture of old stone, and he read the way old stone behaved, without hurry, without warmth. He did not look at her while he read. He looked at the file or past her, or at nothing in particular. He listed Earth's wars first, then the pollution records, then average human lifespan, which drew a low sound from the Duran delegate on the upper left, not a laugh, but something close, then biological fragility, then internal political division, then the note that humans had achieved faster-than-light communication only 11 years prior and had not yet achieved faster-than-light travel independently. Each point landed in the chamber and stayed there. Riva did not shift in her chair. She had been a diplomat for 19 years. She had sat in rooms where people wanted her to feel small. She had learned that the most useful thing she could do in those rooms was breathe evenly and keep her hands still. Goss reached the end of the file. He set it down. He looked at her for the first time. The verdict, he said, was as follows. Earth and its people were formally classified as primitive under Galactic Council Statute 7, Article 3. The application for membership was denied. Earth was assessed as politically unstable, biologically fragile, and a likely liability to Council operations. A 5-year observation period was recommended before a second application could be considered. The chamber was quiet. Riva asked if she could speak. Goss said she could. She said, "Give us 1 year." Several delegates exchanged looks. The Solani representative, a pale blue figure in the upper right, tilted his head slightly. Goss looked at her the way someone looks at a thing that has surprised them, not by being impressive, but by speaking at all. She did not elaborate. She did not list what humanity would do or promise what it would achieve. She said 1 year, and she waited. Goss asked what 1 year was expected to demonstrate. She said, "Whatever you need to see." The sound that came from the chamber after that was layered. Different species laughed in different ways, some with sound, some with movement, some with a change in the light their skin produced. The Duran made a deep rolling sound. The Vreth, all 3 of them, produced a slow exhalation that was their version of amusement. The chamber filled with it, briefly, the way a room fills with smoke, quickly and from all directions. Goss let it run for a moment. Then he raised one hand and it stopped. He said, 1 year is granted. The council expects nothing. Riva said thank you. She picked up the small folder she had brought with her, which contained nothing useful, and walked out. The corridor outside the chamber was long and high and empty. Her footsteps made no sound on the floor, which was a material she did not know the name of. She walked to the end, turned left, and found the small waiting area where her assistant, a young man named Rui, was sitting with 2 cups of something that had been described to them as similar to tea, but which tasted like neither tea nor anything else. Rui looked at her face and knew. She sat down, she picked up one of the cups, she drank from it. "Denied," she said, 1 year to prove it wrong." Rui was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what the plan was. She said she did not have one yet, but she knew where to start. They needed someone watching, not the council's observer, their own. Someone who would look at humanity the way a stranger does and report back honestly. Rui asked if that was really going to help. Riva looked at the cup in her hands. It was warm, at least, whatever it was. She said, "I don't think the council has ever watched anything the way they're going to watch us this year. Every ordinary thing we do is going to go into a report somewhere. So we do what we do. We just do it where they can see. Rui thought about that. He said, that's either very smart or very optimistic. Riva said those two things were not always different. They sat in the corridor for a while longer. Above them, through a long window, the star field stretched out in every direction, enormous, indifferent, full of species who had already decided what humans were. Riva looked at it without expression. She was already thinking about the next step. Back inside the chamber, Goss handed the Earth file to a junior clerk and told him to place it in the pending review section. The clerk asked which shelf. Goss said the bottom one. He had already moved on to the next item. Dale had been given a small observation vessel, a datapad loaded with council reporting templates, and a 3-month food supply that tasted like compressed grain in 6 different shapes. The shapes did not change the taste. He had already established this on day 2. He parked his vessel at a comfortable distance from Earth and opened his first report template. The template had 47 fields. He filled in the basic ones of planet classification, atmospheric composition, population estimate, technology tier, and then reached the field labeled notable cultural behaviors and stopped. He watched a traffic intersection for 11 minutes. Vehicles stopped when a light changed. Every single one of them. Hundreds of vehicles all stopping for a light. He wrote, basic compliance with social systems observed, and moved on. He did not expect to be interested. He had observed 3 pre-membership species before Earth, and all 3 had been either frightened of him or trying to negotiate something. He had filed his reports, been reassigned, and thought very little about any of them afterward. He expected the same here. On day 9, a storm hit the eastern coast of one of Earth's larger landmasses. Not unusual. He noted it. What he noted next was unusual. Within 6 hours of the storm, vehicles were moving toward the affected area, not away from it. He zoomed in. The vehicles carried water, food, equipment, people in bright-colored clothing. More arrived through the night. By morning, there were thousands of them in an area that had been flattened. They were not waiting for instructions. Different groups found each other and started working without anyone coordinating them from above. He watched for 4 days. The city did not come back, but something was going up where it had been. He filed it under disaster response, standard, and moved on. Then the Duran envoy's ship went down near Earth's moon. The envoy's name was Ket. He was a minor trade official, 3rd tier, no political significance. His ship had experienced a cooling failure on approach and come down hard on a supply platform orbiting between Earth and its moon. The Council sent a formal notification. Standard rescue protocol estimated arrival of a Council medical vessel in 9 days. Dale watched Earth's response. Within 3 hours, a small human medical ship had docked with the platform. He watched the feeds from his vessel, a doctor, 2 assistants, equipment that looked old but functional. The envoy had internal injuries and a toxic reaction to something in the platform's emergency oxygen supply, which was not calibrated for Duran biology. This was a complicated problem. The doctor did not leave for 3 days. She slept in short intervals on a fold-out surface next to the medical bay. She communicated twice with a specialist on Earth's surface about Duran physiology because she did not know it well enough and said so plainly. She asked questions. She waited for answers. She adjusted. When the envoy's condition worsened on the 2nd night, she did not call the council for guidance. She worked. On day 3, Ket was stable. Dale sat with this for a while. He looked at the reporting template. He typed, medical assistance rendered to Duran national, non-obligatory, outcome positive. He looked at it. He deleted non-obligatory. He typed it back in. He left it. The 3rd thing happened 3 weeks later at a diplomatic school near one of Earth's mid-sized cities. The school had been set up as part of the Early Contact Program, children of various visiting species attending alongside human children, a symbolic gesture that the council viewed as mostly irrelevant. Dale had a passive feed from the school's external cameras. A young Vreth child, grayscaled, about half the height of the human children, newly arrived, was sitting alone at midday at the edge of an outdoor area. The other children were eating in groups. The Vreth child had food but was not eating. It was sitting very still in the way Vreth children sit when they are overwhelmed but trying not to show it. A human girl walked over. She was small, perhaps 6 years old. She sat down next to the Vreth child without being asked, without looking around to see if anyone was watching. She put her own food between them. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she pointed at something in the food and said something that Dale's audio feed did not capture clearly. The Vreth child looked at the food. Then it looked at the girl. Then it picked up one of the items she had pointed at and ate it. Dale watched this for longer than it lasted. He opened his report. He wrote, "Consistent pattern of unprompted assistance observed across multiple contexts. No apparent motivation of status or obligation." He read it back. He saved it. He did not send it right away. He made himself eat his compressed grain, which still tasted the same in all 6 shapes, and he looked at Earth through the observation window for a while. It was a blue and green and white thing, mostly unremarkable from this distance. He sent the report the next morning. He marked the cultural behavior field as assessment ongoing, classification pending. The template did not have a box for what he actually thought. The back chamber of the council hall had no public record feed. This was not a secret. Everyone who used the room knew why they used it. Goss sat at the narrow table with 2 other council members, Rel of the Solani and a Durin named Vor, not As, who was the other Durin delegate and generally less cooperative. They were reviewing the situation in Sector 14 Bravo without officially reviewing it. A mining operation had been disputed for 60 years between 2 regional factions, the Gary and the Askai. Neither was a council member. The dispute had been sitting in a low-priority queue for most of those 60 years because neither faction had the resources to escalate it, and the council had no interest in a sector with modest mineral output and no strategic value. Recently, it had moved from simmering to almost boiling. 2 ships on each side were holding position in the asteroid belt. No shots yet, but soon. Goss had looked at the file, then he had looked at the calendar. Earth had 8 months left. He did not say what he was thinking out loud. He did not need to. Rel understood. Vor understood. The council would simply not assign a mediator to Sector 14 Bravo for the next several weeks. That was all. No active intervention. Just a scheduling delay which happened all the time, which was fully deniable. If the humans found out, which they likely would not, they would have no mechanism to act. They had no council authorization, no diplomatic standing in that sector, no reason to be there. Goss closed the file. He said, "The queue is very full this quarter." Rel said, "Yes, unfortunately." Vor said nothing but stopped looking at the file, which was the same as agreeing. Dale received the communication routing log 2 days later. He was not supposed to receive it. It had been attached to a standard sector briefing packet by a clerical error. A junior council staff member had CC'd his observation vessel in the distribution list because it was in the relevant sector range. The error was corrected 4 hours later, but Dale had already opened it. He read it 3 times. He sat with it for the rest of that day. He filled out no reports. He ate his grain. He looked at Earth. He looked at the routing log again. He was an observer. His role was to watch and report, not to act, not to advise, not to intervene. He had filed 14 reports already. He had never sent anything to the human delegation directly. It was not what observers did. He opened a new communication channel, not the official reporting one. A secondary encrypted line, standard for personal communications, which would not be logged in council systems. He sent Riva a message. It contained the sector coordinates, the two faction names, and 4 sentences of context. He did not include his name. He did not have to. There was only one person watching Earth from this distance. Riva read it in her small office at the Earth diplomatic station, which smelled of coffee and recycled air, and the particular tiredness of people working long hours in a small space. She read it twice. She looked at the coordinates. Then she called Pyatt. Pyatt was 61 years old, semi-retired, living in Cape Town. He had spent 30 years mediating resource conflicts in some of the less agreeable corners of Earth's various regions. He had a reputation for patience that other mediators described as almost concerning. He said yes before Riva finished explaining. She called Sana next. Sana was a logistics engineer who had worked with Riva twice before, briefly, in situations that had no official names. She asked 2 questions: how much fuel was available and how long did they have? Riva answered both. Sana said she could make it work. Barreau was Pyatt's suggestion. He was not a diplomat, not an engineer, not anything official. He ran a small restaurant in Lisbon and had grown up in a household where his father had worked trade routes across 3 species territories, which was how Barreau had ended up speaking 4 alien dialects before he was 20. He said yes immediately and asked if he should bring food. Pyatt said yes. Sana borrowed a freighter through a supply contractor the diplomatic station used for routine cargo runs. It was not a beautiful ship. It had a dent along the lower left hull from a docking incident 2 years prior that had never been fully repaired. The interior smelled of machine oil and whatever the previous cargo had been. There were 4 seats in the main cabin and a small galley that Barreau looked at for about 30 seconds before deciding it was workable. They left without filing a flight plan through council channels, which was technically permitted since they were not a council vessel. They filed through the Earth station's internal log, which nobody outside of Earth was monitoring. In his observation vessel, Dale watched the freighter leave. He tracked it for a while. Then he opened a report template, typed nothing for 2 minutes, and closed it again. He had done what he had done. He did not know what came next. He was fairly certain the council would call it a procedural anomaly if anyone ever reviewed his communication logs, which they probably would not. He was also fairly certain that 3 humans and a cook were the strangest mediation team he had ever seen in any report from any planet. He made himself eat his grain. He kept watching. The Gary ship opened communications on day 1 only to tell them to leave. The Sky ship did not open communications at all. Pyatt was not discouraged by this. He had been told to leave many times before. He considered it a first contact, not a rejection. Barreau sent a message to the Sky ship in their dialect, not a diplomatic message. He asked them a question about their water recycling system, because Sana had looked at their ship class and estimated they had been holding position for 30 days, and their water recycler was probably running at reduced capacity. The Sky opened a channel 4 minutes later to ask how he knew that and who he was. Barreau told them he was a cook and that reduced capacity recyclers made a specific harmonic at this distance if you knew the ship class. The Sky said nothing for a moment. Then they asked what he wanted. He said he wanted to know if they would eat, not negotiate, just eat. The channel stayed open. Day 1 ended with both ships still in position, but both channels open. Day 3, Barreau made a dish that used a spice common in Gary trade routes. He had brought it from Lisbon, from a supplier who imported it through 3 intermediaries. The smell reached the Gary delegation when they boarded for what Pyatt had called an informal meal, which had no agenda and no recording. The lead Gary delegate, a sharp-faced being named Tour, stopped moving when he smelled it. He looked at Barreau. Barreau said his father had traded in Gary space for 8 years. He had grown up eating what came home in his father's bags. Tour sat down without being asked again. Later, when the Sky delegate made a comment about Gary territorial claims that was technically accurate but designed to sting, Barreau laughed. Not a diplomatic laugh. A real one. He said the translation of the ASCII word for the disputed zone literally meant the place where nobody wins and both sides know it, and he found it funny that they were both still fighting over something their own language had already given up on. Tor looked at the ASCII delegate. The ASCII delegate looked at Tor. Neither of them laughed, but something shifted in the room. Day 6, Pyatt asked each delegation separately the same question. He asked it quietly, toward the end of a long session when people were tired and had stopped performing. He said, "Forget what you want. Tell me what you're most afraid of losing." The Gary said, "The route, not the minerals. The route through that sector was how they moved goods, how they maintained contact with their outer settlements. The mining operation sat on the only viable navigation corridor for their class of ship. If the ASCII held it, the Gary would be cut off not from resources but from their own people." The ASCII said, "The record. Their ancestors had worked that belt for 3 generations before a legal dispute had transferred the formal claim. They were not trying to get rich. They were trying not to disappear from the history of that place." Pyatt wrote both answers in his notebook. He sat with them for 1 full day before going back to either delegation. He came back with a proposal that gave the ASCII formal historical recognition of their ancestral claim, recorded in the sector registry, permanent, not subject to commercial override. In exchange, navigation rights through the corridor were guaranteed to Gary vessels under a passage treaty rather than a territorial claim. Nobody owned the space. Both sides had what they actually needed. Day 9, Sana formatted the agreement on her work tablet. She used plain language, no council template, no legal padding. It was 4 paragraphs. Both delegations read it twice. Tor asked one clarifying question. The ASCII delegate asked none. Both sides signed it. The trip back to Earth was quiet. Pyatt slept in his seat almost immediately after departure. Sana ran fuel consumption estimates for the return journey. Barreau cleaned the galley and made coffee, real coffee, from beans he had brought from Lisbon, because he had learned long ago that the end of a hard job deserved something that tasted like itself. The agreement transmission arrived at the council offices 3 days later. It was processed by a routine intake clerk who flagged it as an unsolicited submission from a non-council entity. The clerk forwarded it to the Sector 14 Bravo file manager, who had not looked at that file in 6 months. Eventually it reached Goss. He read the 4 paragraphs. He read them again. He looked at the date. He looked at the names of the signatories. He looked at Riva's station code and the transmission header. He sat at his desk for a while. The chamber clerk knocked and asked if he was ready for the afternoon session. Goss said he needed 5 more minutes. The clerk waited. It was the first time in 11 years that Goss had asked for 5 more minutes before a session. The clerk did not know what to do with that information, so she went and got herself a drink of water and came back. Goss was ready. He did not mention the Sector 14 Bravo outcome in the session. There was nothing to mention. It had resolved itself officially. That was all it was. He moved on to the next item on the agenda. The platform had no name. The species that built it had no name anymore either. They had been gone for somewhere between 400 and 600 years, depending on which dating method the council used, and the council used 3 methods and disagreed with itself on all of them. What the platform had was mass, approximately 9 kilometers of dark angular metal, and a targeting system that had just powered back on after what the engineers estimated was a 300-year dormancy cycle. It was now reading heat signatures in a populated star system and beginning to charge. 3 inhabited planets were in range. Combined population, somewhere over 4 billion. The council emergency session was loud. 12 delegates talking at once, 3 requesting procedural clarification, 1 asking for a translator because the urgency was causing people to revert to native speech patterns. The committee review protocol for weapons-related incidents required full board authorization across two oversight bodies, which meant a minimum of 6 weeks. Riva watched from a side room through a small screen. She did not watch for long. She did the arithmetic, 6 weeks. She looked at the charge rate in the briefing data. She looked at the population figures. She looked at the 6 weeks again. She found Iwo through a university contact, a structural physicist who had spent 9 years modeling defunct alien architecture. He answered her call from a small office full of printed diagrams. He listened to her describe the platform and asked 4 questions. His 4th question was whether anyone had checked the power cycling architecture, because platforms from that construction period had a specific vulnerability in their restart sequence that only appeared in the first 90 seconds of full charge. Riva asked if that was useful. Iwo said it depended on whether someone was willing to be inside the vulnerability window while exploiting it, because the platform would be targeting anything warm-blooded within that 90 seconds before the cycle locked. Riva said she understood that. She called Pyatt. He picked up on the second ring and said, "Where and when?" She called Sana. Sana asked for the platform's mass specs, said she would look at approach angles, and told Riva she would need a better ship than last time. Riva said she was working on it. She called Barreau last, not because he was least important, but because she knew he would say yes, and she wanted to end the calls on something solid. Barreau said yes. He asked if he should bring food. She said yes, bring enough for 3 weeks. Sana got them a ship through a contact at a deep space geological survey company. It was newer than the freighter, had better shielding on normal operational settings, and smelled less like machine oil. It had a proper galley, which Barreau assessed in 40 seconds and called adequate. They filed no council flight plan. There was no mechanism in council protocol for what they were doing, because what they were doing did not exist in council protocol. The journey took 6 days. Iwo spent most of it building a structural model of the platform from archived data and 2 academic papers he had co-authored on extinct civilization construction methods. He drank a great deal of coffee. He slept when Pyatt told him to sleep, which worked both times because Pyatt had a way of saying things that made arguing feel more exhausting than complying. They reached the platform on day 7. It was larger than the briefing images had suggested. In person, in the dark, it was the kind of large that changed how you thought about the word. No lights on its surface. No movement. Just mass, and the low hum that Sana confirmed matched the charge cycle frequency. Iwo mapped it for 2 days. He walked Sana through the approach geometry. The platform's targeting system tracked heat, not metal, which meant the ship could get within range if they cut internal heating to minimum and moved slowly. But the exploitation window, the 90-second gap where the restart cycle was vulnerable, required them to be close, engines running warm, shielding at standard. Fully visible, fully targetable. The plan was to get in, trigger the window, cut the power relay Iwo had identified in the base structure, and get out. The window was 90 seconds. The relay cut would take 60 if everything went right. Pyatt wrote the math on a piece of paper and put it on the table. Sana looked at it. Barreau looked at it. Iwo said, "It works or it does not. The physics does not change based on how we feel about it." Pyatt said he thought that was as good a case for doing something as he had ever heard. They voted 4-0. On the day of the run, Barreau made breakfast before anyone else was awake. He did not know why exactly. It felt like the right thing to do with the time. Sana flew them in on the cold approach. She moved the ship the way someone moves through a room where a person is sleeping, not slow from fear, but careful out of respect for the situation. The platform's hum grew as they got close. When they hit the window, Sana brought the engines up. The platform's targeting system registered them. Iwo had 47 seconds left when the relay went. The hum stopped. The 3 planets stayed where they were. Nobody on them knew how close it had been. Nobody would unless someone told them, which nobody did. The council received a short transmission 6 hours later. Platform disabled, no casualties, coordinates attached for follow-up retrieval. The transmission was signed with Riva's station code. On the way home, Pyatt slept. Sana ran the numbers one more time. Iwo started writing a paper about the platform's power architecture, because it was too interesting not to. Barreau made dinner. Some moments deserved food that tasted like it had been thought about. The year ended on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar. Nobody in the Galactic Council Hall knew or cared what day of the week it was on Earth, but Riva knew, and she found it quietly funny, the kind of thing you notice and say nothing about. She sat in the same chair, still too small. The light was still the same white and even and cold. The 12 delegates were in the same elevated positions. Goss had the file again. This time it was thicker. The session was scheduled as a formality. The outcome had been discussed in the back chamber 3 days prior, in the room with no public record feed. Goss had not said the words fixed outcome. He had simply outlined the standard criteria, and the standard criteria had not changed, and Earth still did not meet the standard criteria in several measurable ways. The delegates had nodded. It had taken 11 minutes. Oz had not been in that meeting. He had been in a different meeting, one he had requested privately, with 2 delegates who were not Vreth and not Solani. Nobody had logged that meeting either, but for different reasons. The session opened. Goss began the standard address. Oz requested the floor. Goss paused for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be rude, but long enough for anyone paying attention to notice, and granted it. Oz stood. His voice carried without effort. He said that before the vote proceeded, he wanted to enter a historical note into the record. The Duran people had been classified primitive under Galactic Council Statute 7, Article 3, approximately 400 years prior. The classification was later reversed. The Duran now held 2 permanent council seats and had contributed to 17 interspecies agreements. He said he had been instructed never to mention this to a human delegation. He said he was mentioning it anyway. He sat down. The chamber was very quiet. Dale was sitting in the observer section, which was technically not part of the voting floor. Observers did not speak during sessions. Observers filed reports. Observers sat quietly. He raised his hand. 3 delegates looked at Goss. Goss looked at Dale for a long moment. The chamber waited. Goss said, with the particular flatness of someone doing something they know is unusual, "The observer is recognized." Dale stood. He had been cutting the speech down for weeks because everything he removed made what remained clearer. He said, "I have filed 41 reports on Earth. I want to say something that is not in any of them." He said, "The Council's classification system measures what we already know: technology tier, military capacity, political stability, lifespan. These are measurements of things we have seen before. We built the tools to find what we expected to find." He said, "I watched a woman stay awake 3 days to save someone she had no obligation to save. I watched 3 people with no weapons walk into a 60-year conflict and end it in 9 days using patience and one question nobody had thought to ask. I watched 4 people fly into the targeting range of a weapons platform because the math said it was possible and someone needed to do it." He said, "None of that fits the reporting template. That does not mean it is not real. It means our criteria are missing something." He said, "The word primitive says more about our measurement tools than it says about humans." He sat down. The chamber was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The vote was not unanimous. Goss voted against. 2 other Vreth delegates voted against. The Solani representative abstained, but the count came back 9-3 with 1 abstention, and Earth's provisional membership passed, and the clerk entered it into the formal record in the same plain font as everything else, because the formal record did not use special fonts for things that mattered. Riva did not stand up. She did not make a sound. She sat in her small chair and looked at the results display on the screen in front of her, and she stayed very still for a moment. Then she took out her datapad and wrote a message home. It was addressed to her mother, who had been following the year the way parents follow things their children are doing far away, closely, quietly, without saying how worried she had been. The message said, "Told you so." She sent it and put the datapad away. The session ended. Delegates began moving toward the exits. Dale crossed the floor toward her, and she stood and offered her hand, and he looked at it for a moment. Solani did not shake hands as a custom, and then he took it and shook it, a little awkwardly, because he had clearly decided it was worth learning. She said, "Thank you." He said, "I only said what I saw." She said that was usually the hardest part. He had nothing to argue with there. She walked to the exit. The corridor was the same long and high stretch it had been a year ago. Her footsteps still made no sound. She was almost at the end when she heard slow footsteps behind her. She did not turn around. Gauss passed her on the left. He did not look at her. He did not say anything. But he paused just for a moment, a full stop, not a stumble. Then he walked on. Riva walked on too. Rui was waiting at the end of the corridor with 2 cups of the tea-adjacent substance. She took one. It was warm. Earth was in the star field now, officially, with a seat and a voice, and a file that had been moved from the bottom shelf to somewhere better. She drank it,